Good evening, everyone, and welcome to a night of spine-tingling terror. Tonight, we journey deep into the heart of the wilderness to share some of the most horrifying tales ever told. Prepare yourself for a night of fear and suspense as we uncover the dark secrets lurking in the shadows. So pitch your tents, gather close, and let the nightmares begin.
I once held a hunting lease in Middle Georgia, an old abandoned hunting camp that hadn't been used in years. I'm not superstitious at all, but this place was legitimately unsettling. The camp sat miles down an overgrown dirt road, completely surrounded by dense wood. It was easily the most secluded place I had ever been to. I hunted there a lot, alone, but no matter how many times I went, I could never shake the feeling that I wasn't really quite alone. There was a locked gate at the front of the property, yet somehow we'd often find the cabin's front door wide open, even when we knew we had locked it. That was creepy for sure, but that's not the part that made me leave for good. One evening I was hunting in a small valley near a food plot we'd planted along a creek that bordered the property. The second I sat down, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but even with a .308 loaded with ballistic-tipped rounds in my hands, I didn't feel like the top predator out there. Still, the forest was alive. Birds calling, squirrels rustling, the usual sounds of a Georgia evening. But then out of nowhere, silence reigned. Everything just stopped. No birds, no insects, no movement. It felt like the entire woods had turned to stare at me. It was getting dark fast anyway, and that eerie quiet had me on edge. So I packed up and started heading back to the cabin. About 100 yards from my stand, that feeling hit me like something was right behind me. I spun around, rifle up, aiming back down the trail towards the food plot. And that's when I saw it. Something stood in the middle of the path. Not a person, not a deer. I could barely make out its shape in the fading light, but it was tall, lean, and wrong. It almost looked like some kind of bipedal deer, but I'd never seen anything quite like it. It didn't move, it didn't make a sound. It just stood there staring at me. I didn't wait to find out more. I turned and booked it back to the cabin, packed up my gear and got the hell out of there. I never went back. I just let the lease run out. Some things just aren't worth knowing. Back in 2003, me and my partner were both living at his mother's house. Most days we'd get home from work at around 5, get dressed, and then we would go into these woods in the hills just outside the town we live in. For context, those woods are a whole 12 miles long and 4 miles wide. There are breaks in the woods with farmland and fields, creating separate woods over these hills with different names. You can walk through these woods if you want. Their paths winding through most of the woods as trails, and if you want to walk over the span of hills from one side to the other, you can if you really want to. There are paths winding through most of the woods as trails, just most of it through the woods and uphill if you're coming from the south. The one we always went to is called Wind Down Woods. So me and my partner would go to these woods nearly every day after we finished work, just to go for a walk, a smoke, or both. We went about doing our usual routine, walking around and talking about our days, following the trail in these woods that loop around a large set of trees, with more around you on the outside. It would kind of look like a messed donut from a bird's level eye view, I guess. We were walking on the path that takes you back up towards the top of the woods. That path also takes you down towards the car park, once you get to the meeting point of all paths. That's when we see this man in the distance walking down the path at point B, the one where the trail just goes up to the woods beyond Winedown. We've still got to get to the meeting point of all the paths to get back to the car. At this point he's pretty far away from us, but I still had a bad feeling because the first thing I noticed about this man when we got closer was that he was wearing office shoes and carrying a pair of hiking boots while seemingly on a walk in the woods. We were talking about this guy as we were walking up and laughing about how strange it was. The guy was walking faster than us, and he was going downhill and reached the meeting point of the paths a few minutes before we did, but we couldn't see him the whole time. When we got to the meeting point of the paths, all he did was stand there. He didn't do anything. He just stood and was looking around. I had a really bad feeling at this point, as he didn't even look like he was lost. He just looked like he was waiting for something. My partner and I were pretty weirded out at this point, and were thinking about turning away and heading back down the woods and going back around the long way just to get away from his weird-ass vibes. In the end, we decided that walking back down into the woods would ultimately look way too suspicious, as the man had definitely seen us walking up the path towards him at the same time we'd seen him walking down. So we just kept walking up. The whole time this guy was still just standing there and looking around with his shoes in his hand, having no other choice than to walk past him to get down the path to the car park. So we went up and past him. Getting close to him, I saw something that worried me more than it weirded me out. The guy had a backpack on, and there was a handle coming out of it. It was the handle of a hammer or an axe. I knew it couldn't have been anything else. He hadn't been on a phone at all the whole time we'd seen him, not even when he was just loitering around. Just more and more stuff adding up and freaking us out. As we walked past him and started down the path towards the car park, the guy decides he now knows where he needs to go without getting a phone out or a compass, and begins to walk behind us. We were freaking out, and so was my partner, who usually doesn't get paranoid about stuff like this. I do it all the time for no reason, but this guy was not right. There were no other cars in the car park, so he had no reason to be walking there. We were walking as fast as we could without running away from this guy, and after what felt like a lifetime, we got in the car, locked the doors and drove off. Cut to just the other week, and me and my partner are at our friend's house for their birthday, just hanging out, meeting their other friends. We hadn't met them before, but were having a blast. As usual with every small group hangout, it got late, and we started talking about weird experiences. We'd had spooky encounters, and obviously we told everyone about our encounter with this really strange man in the woods. A couple of the girls at this hangout work at a reserve called Fine Court. It's one of the woods in the hills I've been talking about. They seemed pretty rattled by the story we had told, and said that they had one that would make it worse, but they had to tell the group. So one evening, while Emily was on closing shift with her manager, they'd been cleaning up the cafe and doing final checks, when her manager tells her that he's good doing the rest by himself and for her to just go home. Who doesn't want to hear that? So off she goes to her car, sits there a bit to chill and rolls a cig before driving home. Later that night she gets a text saying, "Don't ask, just don't come into work tomorrow." She finds out that after she left work, her manager had finished cleaning up like he said and had gone to his vehicle to leave. Getting into his car, a man approached him from out of the woods and began wrestling him in an attempt to steal his car keys. Managing to get the man off him and into his car, the manager drove away and called the police. After the police, they connected some dots of a call they had received that evening from a concerned neighbor living in a village a few miles from Fane Court, reporting a suspected burglary at one of her neighbors. Another call from a mental health institute in town, about as far away from ours from these woods in the opposite direction, saying one of their patients had escaped. Turns out the police put the whole story together. This man escaped, got a haircut, and then walked miles to the village in the middle of nowhere. Broke into this house he thought was abandoned that was actually the home of an elderly couple. The man was completely disabled and wheelchair-bound, and his carer was his wife. The man took the life of the elderly lady and just left the man in the house before leaving and walking into the woods, wandering around them and looking for someone with a car he could steal. That's when he ended up at fine court and tried to take her manager's car, running off in the woods again to find someone else. Me and my partner are sure this is the same man we saw acting suspiciously at Windown all that time ago, as their story matched up with ours perfectly in regards to time frames. We would have seen him after he tried to steal the manager's car and ran back off into the woods. The police caught him the next day just wandering around in the woods up there. He was following us back down to the car, but who's going to try and jump two guys in an open space when one of us could have easily made it to the road? I think he was trying to freak us out to get us to go back into the woods when he stopped at that meeting point and was loitering. This still horrifies me to this day, and I'm glad we're still around to share the story. A few years ago, I was working as a consultant for the Provincial Forestry Service, mapping fire lines, fuel loads, ash pits, and fire activity using an IR/LiDAR equipped drone. The job had me airlifted onto vantage points above active wildfires where I would deploy my equipment, gather data, and then get picked up again by helicopter. After a few days of this, I got into a rhythm, as much as you can when your ride is doing a toe-in landing, while barely sticking the tip off one skid onto a rocky outcrop, just close enough for me to jump out without breaking my neck. Then I had to grab a 70-pound equipment case before it rolled off the ledge. But that morning something felt off. I got dropped onto a ridgeline barely 2 feet wide with a 1,000-foot drop on either side. Below me, the entire mountainside was on fire. The blaze had been aggressive overnight, and the air was thick with smoke and heat. Still, I got to work, flying my mapping route, packing up, and radioing the helicopter for pickup. I could hear it approaching, but I couldn't see it. For 10 minutes I listened, and as it got closer, then moved away. Finally, the pilot radioed back, "We can't pick you up, too much smoke. Can't see the drop point or the alternate." Then came the kicker. If you walk down to the northeast, the fire isn't as bad there. That's when it hit me. I was a 60-year-old cancer survivor, a partial amputee, standing alone on a mountain with 70 pounds of gear. I was too old for this. I had to haul myself and $55,000 worth of equipment through an actively burning wildfire. So that's exactly what I did. For the next 4 hours I was certain these were my last moments on Earth. Trees were collapsing around me, burning debris rained down, constantly setting parts of me on fire. Every few steps I had to drop to the ground and roll in the dirt to put myself out. I got hit, burned, and choked on smoke, but kept on moving. Eventually a team of firefighters found me and guided me to a safe landing zone where the helicopter was waiting. I spent 2 days in the hospital with smoke inhalation and more burns than I could count. Souvenirs from every time I wasn't fast enough to smother the flames. That was my last wildfire. I had the privilege of saying, "Nope, I'm done." But the people who fight these fires by choice, they're different. Crazy in the best possible way, and they have my respect forever. Every year, my friends and I take our families deep into the mountains for our Every year, my friends and I take our families deep into the mountains for our annual camping trip. A place so remote, you could scream for hours and no one would hear you. No cell service, no roads for miles. and at least 200 kilometers from the nearest hospital. It was a tradition, something we looked forward to all year, a chance to escape and feel safe, to be surrounded by people we trusted. Until the year we made the mistake of bringing a stranger. One of my buddies invited a co-worker to join us. He seemed normal enough at first, but from the moment we arrived, something about him felt off. He was trying too hard, too eager to impress, too quick to make jokes about violence, guns, and fights. The kind of guy who needs everyone to know how tough he was. That first night we were drinking by the fire, laughing, swapping stories, and then the new guy starts getting loud. At first it was just dumb, awkward jokes, then personal attacks, then full-blown aggression. It was like he was hunting for a fight. When someone finally told him to shut the hell up, he snapped. He lunged at one of our guys, swinging, screaming, and completely out of control. He got thrown to the ground almost immediately, but instead of backing off, he made the worst mistake of his life. He reached for his pistol. I was on my feet before I even had time to think. My rifle was up, 2,000 lumens of tactical light blasting straight into his face, and every muscle of my body was tight, waiting for the next move. One more inch, and I was going to paint the ground with his skull. Put up your hands or I'll turn your head into a canoe. His entire body locked up. The rage vanished from his face in an instant, replaced with pure animal fear. His hands shot into the air and his voice started shaking. He began whimpering, apologizing, and calling me my friend over and over, like it would somehow save him. He knew without a shadow of a doubt that he had just come seconds away from dying. We took every weapon off him, pistol, knives, even a goddamn hatchet, and tossed them on the far side of camp, and made it very clear that he was done. The trip was over. We shoved him into his car and told him not to move until we were gone. I was so pissed that night. I didn't even drive home. I grabbed a motel room in the nearest town, still fuming that my one trip of the year had been ruined. By morning, I figured I'd at least salvage the weekend, maybe head back up and see if he was gone. When I got there, the campsite was empty. His car, his gear, his weapons, everything gone. But right where his car had been parked, sitting alone in the dirt, was a single pair of white briefs, absolutely filled to the brim with feces. The man had been so scared, so completely, utterly broken in that moment, that he had literally defecated himself. To this day I still laugh about it, and we haven't invited a single newcomer since.
When I was a teenager, like around 13 or 14, one of my mates from school lived in a kind of countryside area. It's hard to describe. We lived in the suburbs, but his area was a little further out, and less suburban looking at the time. This was 25 years ago. I have no idea what it looks like now, by the way. I went to his place to stay from time to time because there was always adventures to be had around his place. One day, he mentions that there are caves near his house, old mine shafts to be more precise. They were in a kind of national park. I was super interested to go check them out with him, so we planned to go the following weekend. And I'd stay over the night before, and we'd set out early the next morning. The weekend came around and we set out around 8 a.m. We went to the supermarket on the way to stock up on drinks and snacks, and made our way to the caves. The national park was huge and beautiful. It was a great morning for a hike too. Not too hot and not too cold, with a nice blue-skied sunny day. We came to our first cave in the first 20 minutes of hiking. We grabbed our torches, or flashlights, and went in. It was only short, ending in a small chamber. At the far end of the chamber was a sturdy, locked cage-type gate. My friend told me that some were locked off due to the very real chance of cave-ins or flooding. Since it wasn't too long and it wasn't too dark, with a small amount of sunlight coming in from the entryway, we took a break and ate some snacks. It was good being out and about. I was never a fan of early mornings, but this was an exception. We resumed our trip after that short break and came across several more similar caves. There were a few longer ones with evidence of people using them for underage drinking, candles and beer cans, coupled with shitty teenage graffiti. But these were an exception and not too bad. For the most part, people seemed to respect the caves to an extent and cleaned up after themselves. After about an hour and a half, we came across one that was a bit different from the others. It was a longer one, but evidence of people using it for anything was minimal. I was too embarrassed to say so at the time, but I got a really weird feeling when we entered it. It was weird because we had been in so many, and I felt nothing. But this one just made me feel uneasy. I looked at my mate, and he seemed fine, so I didn't say anything, not wanting to appear soft. When we got to the end where the metal gate was, we found that it was unlocked and open. In fact, when we got closer, the wind seemed to blow it open slightly, although I didn't feel any wind. I got a chill up my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It was like it was inviting us in. Without hesitating, my mate was like, "Let's go." And I was a little taken aback. How could he not be picking up on bad vibes here? But I ended up not saying anything, thinking maybe I was just being paranoid and didn't want him hassling me later about it. I regret this now. So we went in. It was so dark in there. Our flashlights barely lit a couple of meters ahead of us. The tunnel seemed to go on and on. There was zero evidence of anyone having been there recently. "What do you think we'll find?" my friend whispered to me. "Dunno," I managed to mumble out. Unease was really starting to hit me now, to the point that I was beginning to feel nauseous. And then it got worse. I felt wind start to blow around my ankles. At first I paid it no mind, but then I thought, where is this sudden wind coming from? The temperature seemed to get colder at each step too. Then I felt the wind brush past my shoulder and face. My heart was beating so hard that I imagined it was echoing in the tunnel. Then I started hearing whispering all around me. It was faint and hard to work out the words. I stopped dead in my tracks and listened. When I stopped, it too seemed to stop. And then the most bone-chilling sound I'd ever heard could be heard in the distance in front of us. Low at first, but definitely loud in no time. It was the bellowing scream of a man. One at first, but then I could make out multiple voices. I felt hands start to grab at me, and I could take it no more. I took off in a sprint back towards the exit. I could only half see the way because the hand that I was holding my flashlight with was pumping up and down as it does when you sprint. I scraped my arms, legs and shoulders against the rough rock walls several times, but I didn't care. It felt like I was running endlessly, but eventually I reached the gate, which I collided into. I thought it would be open still, but for some reason, it was shut. In my panic, I couldn't seem to work out how to open it. Eventually I managed, and it swung towards me, and I left, my mate not far behind me. We finally got out and just kept running, until we finally realized that we were out of that tunnel. Upon realizing this, we collapsed in an exhausted heap struggling to regain our breath. I'm not proud of this, but I also vomited on myself due to the overexertion. It was my only shirt for that weekend too, and I had to borrow one of my mates while we cleaned mine up in secret, because for some reason we thought we'd be in trouble. Just before we got up and left the area where we collapsed, I took one look back at the cave. It was kinda involuntary. I wasn't even thinking. When my eyes landed on that cave entrance, I swear, I could see a shadowy figure standing in the darkness, staring at us. I shot a look at my friend and he saw it too. I was this close to puking again, but I held it down. We got up and hurriedly left the area. That was enough adventure for one day. We went back there a year or so later for nostalgia's sake. Also, we felt bigger and tougher. That particular cave was heavily locked off with no trespassing signs on it, threatening hefty fines. Probably for the best thinking back. Teenage bravado makes young boys do stupid things sometimes, and we may not have escaped so easily a second time.
The first time I took my now wife backpacking, it was supposed to be an easy trip. We followed cougar tracks all the way in. Not a huge deal. It was hard to tell how fresh they were, and they seemed to head up the trail away from us. We pitched the tent, listened to the rain patter against the fabric, and drifted off to sleep. We should have paid more attention to those tracks. Something was watching. When we woke up, something was wrong. The ground outside was covered in cougar prints, every inch. The rain had washed away our own footprints, leaving only one set of tracks, and they circled the tent. This thing had been watching us, studying us and getting closer. You could see where it pressed its nose into the tent, sniffing where our heads were. My side first, then hers. And yet all night we heard nothing. Not a twig snap, not a breath. That thing had been right there and we never knew. We packed up fast. As we hiked back out, we followed two fresh sets of tracks, one larger, one smaller. The cat had never left. It had followed us in. It was following us out. It had been so quiet. Years later we went back. This time it was bears, two black bear cubs, tumbled near the trail, playing, climbing and chasing each other. No sign of the mother. We lingered watching. They were so close, close enough to see the way their little claws dug into the bark as they climbed, and to hear the soft huffs as they played. I pulled out my revolver just in case, and we started walking again, talking loudly so anything nearby would know we were coming. Then my wife froze. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "She's right there." I followed her gaze and her cubs. I gripped the pistol tighter, heart pounding. If she charged, we were done. No running, no sudden movements, just kept walking. We walked, we talked, and pretended not to see her, and she didn't move. Her head turned slightly as we passed, tracking us, deciding whether we were a threat. Step by step we made distance, and finally I dared to look back. She was still there, still watching. And then, just like that, she went back to foraging. I put my gun away, pulse still hammering, and have never been closer to needing it. And yet, animals don't scare me anywhere near as much as people do. I was camping with friends at the Utica Reservoir off Highway 4 in Northern California. It was after Labor Day, a weekday. That meant the place was empty. So empty it felt like we had the whole reservoir to ourselves. After a few fun days we packed up to leave, and I decided to take one last hike before heading out. At the dead end of the road near some closed-off trails and the rugged, slick rock jeep trail, I hiked down to a PG&E lake. It was peaceful, quiet. On my way back up, I wasn't alone anymore. Standing right in the middle of the trail was a man, older, maybe 60, but solidly built, with white hair. I greeted him. He didn't move. All he said was he was waiting for his group to get past some boulders in their jeep, parked about 50 feet up the hill. That's when I noticed a younger man, maybe in his mid-30s, watching from near the jeep. The older man saw my backpack, the name stitched on it, my German last name, caught his eye. He grinned, too wide. "Hey, Junior, he's with us. Show him." Junior lifted his shirt. Beneath it, 2 massive swastika tattoos stretching across his stomach. I forced a nod and a smile. I didn't react. I didn't engage. The older man started chatting about guns, how they'd been shooting all morning at some off-road camp nearby. Junior got back in the jeep, slowly rolling down the trail. The old man stepped up beside me, directing his son around some boulders, and I took my chance. I muttered an excuse, turned up the hill, and walked away fast. Then I saw 2 more jeeps, both loaded with men. They watched me pass, and I gave them some forced nod. But this time no one nodded back, they just stared. I didn't run, but my pulse pounded, and I kept walking, feeling their eyes on my back. When I reached my car, I got the hell out of there. I never saw them again, but for the entire drive home I couldn't shake the feeling that in the middle of nowhere I had just barely avoided something very, very bad. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing camping trip. A double date in the Stanislaus National Forest, not far from Yosemite. I found the site on freecamps.net, a hidden gem at the bottom of a massive gorge. The road wound down steep switchbacks for nearly an hour before we finally reached the bottom. There were 2 campgrounds along the river, the first full and the second completely empty. That should have been the first red flag. We picked a site between the dirt road and the river, separated from the water by dense sagebrush. Right away something felt off. Near the fire pit we found a rat trap, the old-fashioned kind, metal and brutal. Odd. But what was really weird was the rope, tying it to the grill over the fire pit. Down by the river, we found clothes laid out on a log, underwear, socks, pants and a shirt. It looked like someone had just left them there to dry, but there was no sign of a person. We shrugged it off. Maybe a hiker went for a swim and they'd be back. Then the sun went down. It was around 9 p.m. when we were sitting around the campfire, unwinding and drinking beer. My back was to the river. My friend sat across from me facing the water, and that's when I heard footsteps, heavy and deliberate, getting closer, coming from behind me, the riverbank. Did you guys hear that? And before anyone could answer, the footsteps broke into a sprint, boots pounding through the brush, charging straight for us. We jumped up. I still had my axe in my hand from chopping wood, and without thinking I raised it and yelled. And just like that silence, the footsteps stopped instantly. We grabbed it and aimed it towards the sound, but there was nothing. The brush wasn't moving, and there were no signs of an animal or a person, just the crackle of fire and our own breathing. For 10 long minutes we stood there scanning the darkness, waiting for something to happen. Then a stick snapped, not random but close and deliberate, like someone was shifting their weight, like someone was right there just out of sight. That was enough. We threw everything into the van, no packing, no second guessing, just go. What was out there? I've been camping my entire life. I've heard animals moving at night and branches snap, coyotes stalk and deer bolt through brush. It was no animal, it was a person, and they were waiting for something. I'm glad we never got to find out what that was exactly.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed tonight's spine-chilling camping tales. Your support means the world, and I can't wait to bring you more heart-pounding horror stories soon. Stay safe, stay curious, and until next time, keep the campfire burning and share this video, and don't forget to subscribe the channel.